of the simultaneous translation options we have. So on your Zoom menu, there's a button called Interpretation. Today we will deliver the session in English, but we will have simultaneous translation into Arabic, French, Russian, and Spanish. And just a note that our French translator will join the session as soon as possible. We had a few technical issues, but don't worry, they are being taken care of. And as I said, she will join us as soon as she can. And just a note that all languages today will be recorded. You can also use the automated translated captions by selecting a supported language from the captions box in your Zoom menu. So please do note though that these captions are a translation of my original English voice, and in the case of any discrepancies, the meaning and spirit of the original English will prevail. So I am delighted to present this month's topic on Ask the Expert Therapeutic Use Exemptions alongside our expert panelist, Pedro Goncalves, who is the ITA Science and Medical Manager. So welcome, Pedro. Great to have you with us today. Awesome. So to get the most out of today's webinar, we are going to ask you some poll questions, and a reminder to please do get involved because all your answers are anonymous. We're going to answer your questions which have been submitted in the registration link. We'll also answer any questions that come up during the webinar live at the end. And as a reminder, you can write them at any time during the session using the Q&A function. And as I mentioned, we are also recording the session for everyone or anyone who can't attend live. So before jumping directly into therapeutic use exemptions, I'd like to put the topic into context. So as a reminder, the World Anti-Doping Agency publishes a prohibited list. And this list tells us which substances and methods are prohibited and when. As an athlete, you should always check your medication before you use it to avoid inadvertently taking or using a substance or method which is on this list. And this is because anti-doping is based on the principle of strict liability. And this means that an athlete is solely responsible for everything that they use and that is found in their body, regardless of whether there was an intention to cheat or not, or if the athlete was at fault. It's not an excuse for an athlete to say, I didn't know, or my doctor or my pharmacist gave it to me. So Pedro, firing my first question over to you, what happens if an athlete checks their medication and it's on the prohibited list, but they need to use it for health reasons? Pedro, you're still on mute.
Hi. Sorry. So as an athlete and as a person, of course, you have the right to get treated if you're injured or if you have a disease. And if this medication is on the prohibited list, then the sports world and the anti-doping rules allow you to ask for a therapeutic use exemption, so TUE in short. So an approved TUE gives the athlete the possibility to participate in sport without being sanctioned while taking his treatment, while being treated for whatever condition he has. And this TUE usually has a defined validity period and is approved under certain strict conditions.
Thank you, Pedro. And maybe you can explain a little bit about what these strict conditions are.
The conditions are quite easy to understand. They're quite logical. So the first one, of course, is that you need to have a disease or a medical condition, and it needs to be diagnosed. So that's very important. You can't just say, oh, I felt bad, I went to the pharmacy and took something. You need an appointment with a doctor, and you need this condition that you have to be diagnosed by a physician. Second point, which is important, is that it shouldn't bring you above what would be your normal condition. So it shouldn't improve your sporting performance. The third condition is that there is no permitted alternative. So some medications are on the prohibited list and they treat a certain condition. And there are alternatives which are not prohibited. So in this case, a TUE would not be granted. And the fourth one is very logical also. So you shouldn't need the TUE because you've been doping in the past, or you shouldn't, if your condition is due to the fact that you've been doping in the past, then the TUE would not be granted. And yeah, so the easiest example to understand that I always give is that if you have diabetes, you need insulin to treat yourself, and insulin is on the prohibited list. And I think everybody agrees that you shouldn't be forbidden from participating in sport just because you have diabetes.
Thank you, Pedro.
Yeah.
And thank you for providing the example. I think that's always really helpful. So maybe once an athlete has determined, along with their medical professional, because as you mentioned, it needs to be a diagnosed condition, that they meet these 4 criteria. When should an athlete apply for a TUE?
Okay, so this is not an easy moment in an athlete's career or life, because usually what happens is that you got injured, you got to the doctor, they gave you a treatment, and you're already anxious and worried about that. And then hopefully you remember that you have to follow the TUE process. So it's another layer of anxiety. So what happens, the easiest is that as soon as you know that you need a medication, and as soon as you can, of course, not if you're in the hospital bed, but as soon as you can, you should inquire with your national anti-doping agency or international federation if you do require a TUE. It's as soon as possible is the answer that I always give. If the more official answer is you should do it 30 days before your competition. If it's a substance which is prohibited in competition only, there's a few technicalities, but none of these are important in front of the fact that as soon as possible is the best option.
Thank you, Pedro. So as soon as possible, that's what everyone needs to remember. So now we're going to jump into a poll question, and we're going to ask you, our audience, if you have any idea how many TUEs are granted each year globally. So this is all TUEs, and the options that you have to choose from are approximately 3,000, approximately 30,000, or approximately 300,000. So the question is, how many TUEs are granted each year globally? And we'll give probably 30 more seconds for everyone to get their votes in. And we have a more popular answer at about halfway.
And I won't give any hints, apart from the fact that it's a trick question.
No hints at all. Okay, so we'll just give a couple more seconds for anyone who wants to pop a vote in before we close the poll, and I will ask for the results to be shared, please. Okay, so the correct answer is approximately 3,000. The most popular vote was 30,000. So Pedro, have you got any comment on the poll, and then maybe what people assume or think the number of TUEs that are granted each year is?
Yes, so this is the usual answer we get. So either 30,000 or 300,000. So most people get it wrong. I think it's probably linked to the fact that you don't see TUEs all the time on the news, but you do have some exposure, and there's a kind of general feeling that athletes have to take medications all the time because they are injured because of performance. And there's from the global population, there's this impression that athletes are under drugs all the time. And this is not true. And what the statistics show, for example, at not only at the Olympics, but in any situation, it's approximately 1% of athletes that have TUEs. So by far not the majority. Many of these TUEs, in this 1%, many of these TUEs are for very benign diseases and for medications that don't improve performance to a very high level. So this is usually something that's quite reassuring to everybody when we say this. So it's really 3,000 TUEs in every sport in the world. So for every international and national federation in the world. So even in a small country, you have, I don't know, at least 100,000 people participating in sport. So this is quite reassuring, in my opinion.
Thank you, Pedro. Okay, on to my next question for you, Pedro. So perhaps we can cover, I guess, who needs to apply for a TUE, as that's, I guess, what we've just been talking about, a number of TUEs. So is this every athlete involved in every sport at all levels? How does that work?
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why we have only 3,000 TUEs also. It's because only the elite athletes, let's call them like that for now, require a TUE in advance. So if it's you, Nikki, or me, and we go and race the 20Ks here in Lausanne, we don't need a TUE in advance. Well, hopefully you're not injured, but we wouldn't need a TUE in advance. So now we get into the regulations, really. So each international federation and each national anti-doping agency define what is an international level athlete or a national level athlete, respectively. So in the rules of the International Federation, for example, in fencing, the definition of international level athlete is the top 32 ranked athletes in each weapon. Whereas the definition of national level athlete for Switzerland would be maybe, I can't remember by heart, but it's maybe anybody who is in a national football team. So they would be defined as national level athletes. So each federation, each international federation, and each NADO, each National Anti-Doping Agency, defines what is an international level federation or a national level federation. And to help the athletes for which the ITA works, so the federations that have partnered with the ITA, I think your team created a little video that describes the TUE assistant.
Yes, absolutely. And we will play that video now. So this video is, as Pedro said, will show the ITA TUE assistant, which is a tool to help athletes understand which organization they need to apply to get a TUE. So perhaps we can jump to playing the video.
This is a quick demonstration on how to use the ITA Therapeutic Use Exception system, so you'll know exactly where to apply for a TUE and where to find more information. Go to ita.sport, click the Athlete Hub tab, then select TUE Assistant. Just find out if you need a TUE, read the terms and conditions, agree, and click Next. Next, select your international federation. Note that only those partnered with the ITA are listed. If your international federation is not listed, it is not currently partnered with the ITA. Contact your international federation or national anti-doping organization for more information. For this example, let's select FIA. Take a moment to review the international level athlete criteria and carefully see if you fit the description. If you do not meet it, apply to your NADO. If you do, apply directly to the ITA. The assistant will then ask if you already have a TUE granted by your NADO. Do you have one? If yes, email TUE@ita.sport with the subject TUE recognition and include your ADAMS TUE reference number. This ensures your TUE undergoes the TUE recognition process. If not, check whether your medication or its method of administration is prohibited. Visit globaldro.com or the latest WADA prohibited list. If it is prohibited, apply for a TUE by following the instructions on the ITA TUE page, which explain the process. That's how to use the ITA TUE assistant, your quickest way to know where to apply and how to get started.
So that was a quick demonstration of the ITA TUE assistant. As mentioned in the video, that if your international federation is not partnered with the ITA, you would go directly to your international federation to understand the criteria and how you should apply. So Pedro, once an athlete knows which category they fall into, whether they're international level, national level, and that they need to apply for a TUE, what steps should they then take?
So the steps are the same if you are applying to an international federation or to an NADO, right? There's basically two sets of documents. One is the TUE form. So the TUE form is a form that you fill out with your doctor that you need to have signed, and that gives all the details of your application. And then the second set of documents is the medical documents that go along with the submission. So this seems very easy and logical, but about half of the applications that we receive are incomplete. So this is why we insist a lot on this. And each diagnosis, or there are several diagnoses that have specific documents that need to be submitted. And to go back to the diabetes example, it's usually the easiest one. Once again, you need to submit the form. You need to submit your blood sugar levels. So that's a laboratory examination that you went to, and you need a report from your physician confirming that you have diabetes. So these are the documents that you need. It's really important. I continue to insist because it really slows down the process. And of course, the athlete wants to get an answer as soon as possible, but we can only proceed when the documentation is complete. And yeah, that's it on the different steps.
Thank you. Thanks, Pedro. And we've also popped some QR codes on this slide to help whoever needs to apply for a TUE with gathering the correct documentation. So it's the WADA TUE checklists and other TUE resources, which can be accessed through the QR codes. And a reminder that you will get the slides after the session today.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I did a false start here and jumped
That's
this
okay. But we will now go to our second poll question of today's webinar, which is, what are the most common TUEs? And the options that you have to choose from are stimulants, beta-2 agonists, or glucocorticoids. So we'll give a minute or so for everyone to pop their votes in. And Pedro, no hints.
Maybe just a description of what they are. So stimulants is usually what you receive when you have ADHD, so attention deficiency disorders. They can also be used in other diseases, but the most common use is for ADHD. Beta-2 agonists, I'm sure you've seen people with asthma. They have these push air pushes that you do like this, and I'm sure you've seen many people use them. And glucocorticoids, there are things like prednisolone or methylprednisolone, betamethasone, which you get many times when you have a lung infection, bronchitis, and you also get when you have inflammations in the joints, for example, which is a situation that happens to many athletes.
Thank you, Pedro. Okay, let's close this poll, and let's share the results. And Pedro, I'm just going to come straight over to you to provide the answer and maybe the context around the answer as well.
I don't see the result of the poll yet.
Okay, so can you say it now?
I need to.
Okay, so I will read it out. So stimulants, we had 15% of the votes. Beta-2 agonists, we had 35% of the votes. And glucocorticoids came in as the most popular response, which got 50% of the votes.
So maybe this indicates we have a medical population in the assistance. The correct answer is stimulants. So this is of these three classes, it's the one where we receive and grant more TUEs. We could, now I see the results. Yeah. So we could expect, usually what people say are beta-2 agonists, because so many people have asthma and you see it all the time. But the situation with beta-2 agonists is that they're actually mostly allowed, in the sense that if you are using them as the doctor instructs, so for example, Ventolin, I think you're allowed to do 12 pushes per day. I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say 12 pushes per day. So if you are under 12 pushes per day, you do not require a TUE. And this is the situation for everybody, actually, because if you do more than 12, you start to have issues, like you have your heartbeat increases, and well, even if you wanted to cheat, it would be kind of stupid, because it would actually decrease performance. So beta-2 agonists are not a TUE issue, simply because in most situations they are allowed, and you do not require a TUE for beta-2 agonists. Glucocorticoids are easily expected at the top, and because they are one of the most used class of drugs in the world. So they are used to reduce inflammation. As I said, if you have a tendinitis in elbow, knee, shoulder, whatever your sport uses a lot, glucocorticoids help reduce the inflammation. So they shouldn't be used long term. So all the doctors here will know that, because it would be bad for health, but they can be used in short term to reduce the inflammation. They are also used in all kinds of respiratory diseases. So that's really a substance, or a kind of substance that's used a lot, but they are prohibited in competition only. So if you remember the prohibited list, there are substances which are prohibited in competition only, and there are substances which are prohibited all the time. And glucocorticoids are prohibited in competition only. And as I said just before, their use should be limited to a few days. So what usually happens is that you take them out of competition, and therefore you do not require a TUE. So this is the explanation as to why finally beta-2 agonists and glucocorticoids are not at the top. So another trick question, I'm sorry.
Great, thanks, Pedro. So I guess the option of stimulants, which got the least number of votes in our poll, is actually the most common TUE. Just before we jump to our next question, I just wanted to let anyone who would like to listen in French that our French interpreter is now in the French interpretation channel, so you can jump over to listen in French. And so, Pedro, my next question, once a TUE has been granted, is there anything that an athlete should specifically be aware of or have in their mind? They have the TUE, but anything that you would like them to be aware of?
Yes. So each TUE has a specific duration. So at the end of at the end of which it expires automatically. So you can see in this example that the TUE has been granted for 1 year. So if you need to continue to use the substance or the method, it is your responsibility to submit the new application with updated medical information ahead of the expiry date. So you shouldn't wait till the last minute. We usually advise, depending on the substance and disease, to try to reach out about 2 months ahead, because this is usually the kind of time that you need to get a doctor appointment. And and the second important thing, of course, is that the dosage. So the TUE is granted for a certain dosage and route of administration. So if there are modifications to this, if you need more or less or another kind of medication, you have to reach out so that the TUE can be modified or a new TUE is required.
Thanks, Pedro. And maybe a final question from me before we go into the questions that were submitted by our audience today. And this is quite a common question that we get in education. So what would happen in an emergency situation? So something happens and an athlete maybe doesn't have 2 months or 30 days to apply for a TUE. What happens then?
Yeah, so we go back to what I said earlier. So it's really the as soon as possible. As soon as you know that you need the treatment or that you receive the treatment, you should reach out. And there's a specific process for retroactive TUEs and specific conditions for granting a retroactive TUE. So the normal rule for a TUE is that you should get a TUE before starting the treatment. But most people in the world, I think, when they get out of the doctor's appointment and they have a prescription because they are hurt or for whatever reason, they will want to start the treatment as soon as possible, right? So it's not always possible to wait for the TUE to arrive. And so the conditions that for which retroactive TUE can be granted are, as it's written there, so the emergency. So typically, if you crash on your bike and you need a prohibited substance, you are allowed to ask the TUE retroactively. The second point is a little bit the same. So there was insufficient time or other circumstances that prevented you from submitting the TUE. So this can be, once again, if you were abroad at the competition, you started the treatment and you only got back to your normal way of living a few days later. So that's also accepted. Or maybe even the International Federation or your NADO didn't reply to your call so in time. So these are exceptional circumstances that prevented you from submitting the TUE. The third point is, as we said in the beginning, it can happen that if you're not international level and not national level, it can happen that you're tested nevertheless. So because maybe you did an exceptional performance and you were tested, or because you were randomly tested. And these situations are very clear. You were not required to ask for a TUE in advance, so you are allowed to ask for one retroactively. And so this is why, of course, it's very important to keep all your medical documentation when you know that you have received the treatment which is prohibited. So even if you do not require a TUE in advance, keep your documents just in case. If you remember the example that I gave about fencing, about the top 32 fencers, maybe you're 33 or 34, or maybe you were a very good junior the previous year, and this year you're higher in the ranks and you are tested. So yeah, keep your documentation. And the last point is more technical. So it's if you remember glucocorticoids, they are prohibited in competition only. Maybe you stopped your treatment 5, 6, 7 days before the competition, so you're not doing anything wrong because you didn't do, the medication is not prohibited out of competition. It can happen in some situations that a little bit of the medication remains and you are tested positive. So in these cases, you're also allowed to ask for the TUE retroactively.
Thank you, Pedro. So as I mentioned in the registration link, we gave our audience today the opportunity to submit their question in advance. So we have collated all of these and we're going to go to those now, trying to address as many as possible. So the first question that came in from the registration form was, how is trust and integrity maintained throughout the TUE process?
So what I always like to bring up is that the biggest protection we have in place is that every TUE approved or rejected by the ITA is reviewed by a panel of 3 physicians from 3 different countries. So this really protects the process a lot. It reduces issues with potential conflicts of interest. And the other point is that we already have about 40 different international federations that have partnered with the ITA, and we are an independent organization. So this is no longer done internally at the federation. And you know how, sorry, I have a little noise here. Give me a second. And this is very important that the system is outsourced, in my opinion. Of course, I'm defending the ITA a little bit, but also defending people that I know you worked in the federations, and when you work in the federation, it's all about helping the stars and helping the athletes, and nobody wants to bring down somebody for any kind of reason, good or bad.
Thank you, Pedro. On to our second question. How is it determined whether an individual meets the second criteria for a TUE to be granted? And that is that the therapeutic use of the substance or method doesn't or won't, on the balance of probabilities, enhance performance beyond the return to normal health.
Yeah, this is a very important matter, and maybe it's something that we would need to ask WADA, because it's more related to which substances are put on the prohibited list and which are not, because one of the criteria of being on the prohibited list is whether it improves performance. In any case, in TUEs, in most situations, this is not applicable, or it's not a problem. There are not many medications that would improve your performance beyond your natural situation. So like most medications that we take, that everybody takes, just kill the disease. Let's say it like that. There's a few examples like beta blockers. So beta blockers, they are believed to improve accuracy in shooting, for example, but they are taken when you have heart problems. So these are 2 completely different things: the accuracy in shooting and heart problems. And so these are situations where you need to look at the case in much more detail. But the beta-2 agonists that we were talking before, if you are not asthmatic and you take beta-2 agonists, it has close to 0 effect. So there's no point in taking them. And if you are asthmatic and you take them, it just lets you breathe. So generally, it doesn't improve the performance.
Thanks, Pedro. And on to our next slide of questions. And the next question is, does an athlete need a TUE for a dental procedure, which might involve a prohibited substance? And then if so, can a dentist be or step in place of the physician to assist with the TUE application?
Yeah, so there's 3 questions in one here. The only relevant part is prohibited substance. So if there is a prohibited substance, you need a TUE, okay? That's the only thing you need to read from a TUE point of view in this sentence. So the question comes relatively often, and we've seen questions like that. But the situation in real life is that in 99% of cases, if you have a dental procedure, the medications that you receive are not prohibited out of competition. So you do not require a TUE. So in theory, yes, there is a prohibited substance, you need a TUE. In real life, it doesn't happen. And of course, the dentist can help you. He's a physician, and the documentation that we require is always preferably from the physician that treated you or that prescribed the medications to you.
Thank you, Pedro. So our next question, what should an athlete do if they have a chronic disease that requires a long-term medication, which is on the prohibited list?
Submit the TUE, and you submit it to international federation if you're international level, or to your NADO, your National Anti-Doping Agency, if you're national level. I really advise athletes to reach out to their NADOs if the NADO hasn't done it yet, which I think most NADOs, they do get in touch with athletes as soon as they start to be good in their sports. And they have resources and they can give advice in many situations, which it's really their role. And before being international, an athlete is usually national. And so the first step I always advise is to reach out to the NADO. I'm sure they will want and try to help.
And so I guess maybe my follow-up question to this one is there any kind of limit as to how long a TUE can be granted for?
So yes, in the rules it's 10 years, but that's a maximum really, and only applies to diabetes usually. So
Okay.
it would be really the kind of disease that you have for the whole life, and that doesn't require, that doesn't evolve, it doesn't change. So I can't say most TUEs have a certain validity, but if you remember glucocorticoids, they're usually granted for only a few days. So you only use them a few days. So you would not get a TUE for 2 years. You would get it for a few days. So yes, in theory, 10 years. What usually happens is that these are really limited to diabetes. Most ADHD TUEs, for example, the first time that you receive the TUE, it would be granted for 1 year. And then subsequently, if the disease is still present, that you're an adult, the TUEs can go up to 4 years. So I would say for long-term diseases, the normal TUE would be between 1 and 4 years.
Thanks, Pedro. And a nice segue, because I think you just mentioned ADHD, into our next question. Are there any specific guidelines around TUEs for athletes who do have ADHD?
So yes and no. So the process is the same as for any TUE. You need to submit the form and you need to submit the medical documentation. But the medical documentation for ADHD is different from other diseases, of course. And for this, for ADHD or for any other diagnosis, I really invite you to visit the page for which you have the QR code on the slide. You have specific checklists for the documents that you need to provide. And there's also physician guidelines. So if you have a team doctor that doesn't know a lot about TUEs, they can have a look at these documents.
Thanks, Pedro. And as you did mention, we did prepare in advance, and we put the QR code on the screen directly to those checklists for an athlete who may have ADHD. Okay, so on to our next question, and that is, can an athlete apply for a TUE for a supplement?
This usually does not happen. In theory, TUEs can only be granted for substances or methods on the prohibited list in relation to medical products that were prescribed by a doctor, okay? So if there is a prohibited substance in the supplement, it's unlikely that the supplement was prescribed by a medical professional for a medical reason. And therefore, athletes should be vigilant and carefully review the ingredients on the supplements and be aware of contamination, mislabeling risks of supplements, and remembering that supplements are usually not risk-free. Nikki, you probably know if there's another webinar on supplements. Maybe it's always part of the discussions, I know. So again, if a supplement contains a prohibited substance, in our experience, it would not satisfy the requirements of Article 4.2, and the TUE would be refused. But most supplements don't have prohibited substances. Well, I don't know. There's a few online tools for this. There's a few pages that you can visit. Maybe Nikki, you can redirect better than me.
Absolutely. Yes, Pedro, we actually do have our next webinar coming up is on supplements, but I will also ask one of our team who's in the back of the webinar to pop the link into the chat box, which will redirect to the ITA Athlete Hub, which has a page on how to make informed decisions about using supplements to, I guess, reduce your risk as much as possible, acknowledging that no supplement can ever be risk-free, perhaps due to the lower regulations that are required compared to a medication. So Pedro, our next question to you, should an athlete apply for a TUE for an infusion of iron or B12 if it exceeds 100 milliliters?
So this should be an easy question, but it's actually very confusing. It's a three-dimensional problem, okay? I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit out of script, but I'm thinking of the best way to explain this. So the three dimensions are, is the prohibited substance, so is the substance prohibited or not? Is the method prohibited or not? Is the procedure taking place in a hospital or not? Okay? And there's a specific document on WADA's website that you can find. I think it will be shared, right, Nikki, with the audience? Okay. So this document summarizes everything that I'm saying now, but in practice, the situation here is we have iron, which is not a prohibited substance, but we have an infusion of more than 100 milliliters, which is a prohibited method, if and only if it is not given in a hospital. So to reply to the question here, we need to know if this was done in a hospital. If it was done in a hospital, it's not forbidden. If it was done outside of a hospital, so there are some clinics now that are doing infusions for rehydration and things like that. Or maybe usually theories infusions for iron are related to anemia, and maybe some doctors are allowed to do it in their office. That's possible. So this would require a TUE. So to understand this rather three-dimensional complicated problem, I advise to go back to the WADA document, which is what I always do, because I never know by heart for 100% sure what is the situation. If it's a prohibited substance, you would require a TUE always.
Thank you, Pedro. And again, we prepared in advance. We have the QR code right there for our audience to check if they are ever in a situation like this. And I think, yeah, the important thing is use the tools that are available for you so you are exactly sure on what you need to do. Okay, and to our next question. What is the most common reason for a TUE application to be denied? And how is there anything an athlete can do to avoid this?
To avoid having the TUE being denied.
Yes.
Okay, so WADA has a document which is, well, has several documents that are done by the whole sporting community, the anti-doping code, for example, and several international standards. And one of the international standards is the international standard for TUEs. And this document defines all the reasons or all the criteria for a TUE to be granted or not. So if I'm being very straightforward here, if there is a denial, it's because one of these criteria has not been fulfilled. You will remember, maybe you remember, we discussed in the beginning the 4 criteria that are needed to approve a TUE, and the criteria usually that is the most commonly, or is the biggest reason for not having a TUE, is that the diagnosis is not adapted, or the treatment is not adapted to the diagnosis. Yes, it's the diagnosis says you have a broken leg, and the application is for a stimulant. This is not a real life example, but it can happen. It can happen. And maybe the question doesn't come from there. Maybe the question is more about what do I need to do to have the TUE approved, and why does it take some time or longer in some situations. And this is always related to the medical documentation. So in ADHD, for example, there is a requirement to provide a psychiatrist a complete file. So if we get a file from a psychologist or from another kind of medical practitioner, the TUE would not be granted. But this is not really a denial. So this is really an incomplete documentation situation. I think that's probably where the question wanted to go.
Thank you, Pedro. And on to our next question, which I also see coming through in the live questions or related to. Is there an average period of time it takes to process a TUE from a submission to a decision?
So the rules give 21 days as a maximum timeline. We usually take, in average, about a week. But whenever there's urgent requests, it can go much faster. So it can't be 1 hour, but it can happen in some situations. If there is really a serious urgency, that we do it in less than a day. And for example, during the Olympics, we have a setup where we are on site and we're working on TUEs, and the process can go much faster. But we have to remember that the process needs to remain solid. So we still send the documents to our physicians, to 3 physicians that review the documents and that discuss and take the decision. So it's not something that can be done in a few minutes.
Yep. Thank you, Pedro. And maybe we can combine questions 10 and 11, because I think they both relate to potential retroactive TUE. So question 10 is, what should an athlete do if prescribed a preventive medication shortly before a competition, and perhaps they don't have 21 days? I think you've already mentioned that it can be much faster. depending on the situation. But also, so I presume that if there's not enough time in advance, they may be able to apply for a retroactive TUE. And then this leads us nicely into question 11, which is, well, when should an athlete apply for a retroactive TUE?
Yeah, I always go back to you should apply as soon as you know that you need the medication. So Article 4.1 is the one that deals with retroactive TUEs. It describes the different situations where it happened. Emergency, or because there was no time for the TUE to be processed. So typically, if you are very, very close to a competition, there will not be the time to process the TUE. And then it's an unfortunate situation, but it becomes the athlete's responsibility to participate without the TUE, because although it's very likely, if there is a real injury or disease, that the TUE will be granted, it's always possible that it will not. So there's not many solutions. There's a withdrawal from the competition, or participating with the expectation that the TUE will be granted later. Then this really becomes case by case. Although it's very scary, it doesn't happen that much that somebody discovers that they need a TUE a few hours or the day before a competition. If you have the cases here are usually shoulder problems, elbow, knees that need a glucocorticoid, and you don't get these kind of injuries from one day to the other. And there's even some sports, and I'm thinking about cycling, where if you get an injection of glucocorticoids, let's say on Wednesday, you cannot participate in sports for a week. So they go above the anti-doping regulations, because in their mind, if you are so injured, you should not participate in sports. And this is where I wanted to get at. We don't have so many of these requests because usually when you're really injured, you don't participate in the competition.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Pedro. And we'll go to our final page of questions. And so the next one is, does the TUE expiry take into account the washout period of a substance?
So the TUE validity is set to the days of intake. So you take on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. The TUE is valid for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. This can be very complicated, but that's how it happens. In rare situations where there is a positive test for a substance taken out of competition, then the experts, the legal experts, the scientific experts would review the washout period and assess it. Well, they would study the washout period in assessing the whole case.
Thanks, Pedro. And maybe a question 13 on the slide. If a TUE is granted by a national anti-doping organization, is this automatically recognized by other anti-doping organizations? So maybe other NADOs, international federations, major event organizers.
Okay, so NADO TUEs are valid in the whole world. So if you have an Egyptian TUE, it's valid if you go live in Morocco. Most, or let's say 80% of international federations recognize automatically NADO TUEs, and most event organizers also recognize automatically TUEs. So it's usually not an issue.
Okay, thank you. And then final question before we maybe take a couple of our live ones. Should an athlete declare their TUE on the doping control form?
Even though it's not strictly mandatory, it's encouraged.
Awesome. Thank you, Pedro. So we are very close to being out of time, but I would like to take a couple of the live questions. I think the first one, Anna, we've probably already answered that as part of the questions submitted in advance. So maybe we can just go to Bridget's question. And Bridget's question is, should an IF be strict on the TUE form used e.g. only accept the ones submitted using the IFTUE form?
We are usually not strict with this, as long as the form contains all the information that is in other forms, then we don't mind. And we start from the principle that WADA has reviewed, in theory, all TUE forms and that they have accepted them. So the only requirement for the International Federation is that the documentation needs to be provided in French or English.
Thanks, Pedro. And maybe our final live question from Angela. So Angela is saying that she believes that people maybe just don't request a TUE, maybe not quite giving a specific reason for that. But maybe, Pedro, I could ask you the question, if an athlete is feeling like they don't want to request a TUE, or they would prefer maybe to not take the medication because they feel like the TUE process is too complicated, what would you say to them? What's your advice?
Well, this is a process that's in place to protect the athlete. So they should try and take advantage of it because they are allowed to it. That's what I can say. I mean, it's I think all the people that work on the TUE community that I know are I don't like the word, but they're almost client oriented. They are really there to help the athlete. It's a bit outside of the other anti-doping processes where you're trying to. It's a bit negative, You're trying to catch people, you're trying to test them, you request whereabouts. Whereas here you're providing an exemption so that you can do your treatment. And you should not, if your doctor has said that you require medication, then you should not be scared of asking for a TUE because the TUE will be granted. If there is a medical need, if you have the documentation, the TUE will be granted. It's easy to say, and some situations might be complicated, but once again, this process is there to protect the athletes.
Thank you, Pedro. So we are out of time, so I will move to the next slide to wrap up today's webinar. And I'm going to provide you with some useful tips that I think we always share with athletes and have come through from what Pedro has talked about today. So firstly, always check the WADA prohibited list when you get a prescription. Secondly, make sure your TUE application is complete and accurately filled out. Throughout the slides, we have different QR codes to different resources that can support you to do this. Importantly, if you have a change in dose, frequency, your medication is going to be administered in a different way, please contact your TUE committee that granted the TUE in case you need an amendment or to apply for a new TUE. And very importantly, keep track of your TUE expiry date. Pedro mentioned 2 months before as maybe a good time to reapply for a TUE if you need to. And to do this, we suggest put a reminder in your phone or your agenda well in advance of the expiry date. So on our next slide, we have collated TUE resources to help you. As a reminder, you will, of course, get the slides following the session. Now, I do want to acknowledge that we do have some live questions which we didn't answer. If you would like to email us those questions at education@ita.sport, we're more than happy to pass them on to Pedro to help us respond to them. And on this slide, I won't go into details, but we have our webinar schedule for the remainder of the year. So you can see what's coming up and you can register for these now if you would like to. So that just leaves me to wrap up today. As I said, if you have questions, I acknowledge we didn't get to all of them. Email us, education@ita.sport. Pedro, a massive thank you for being our expert today and answering the questions so thoroughly and bringing in the real life examples that you see as part of your daily work. I think that's really helpful. And also thank you to our audience for joining us today, for your participation in the polls, for asking some really great questions. And we do hope that you found this session informative and valuable. So that just leaves me to say, see you all soon. Next month we have supplements, and I wish everyone a great rest of your week. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, everyone.